Folks, this is chapter 29, Neural Control, and this is part 1. We are going to do two 30-minute recordings for this chapter. These are your student learning objectives, which we will go over at the end of the second half of this lecture. So your book starts out discussing ecstasy or MDMA. It's also known as Molly's. And this is an illegal drug that makes some neurons in your brain release an excess of a signaling molecule called serotonin. And what serotonin does is it makes you feel really, really good. Ecstasy can give you basically this pure euphoria or take away any social anxiety. So ecstasy is a psychoactive drug that alters brain function. Unfortunately, once you take ecstasy, you have permanently altered your brain function. Multiple doses of ecstasy alter the structure of neurons that secrete serotonin and decrease their numbers. And like I said before, serotonin promotes this feeling of energy and euphoria. So if you start decreasing the numbers of neurons that actually secrete it after you've taken the drug, then when you come off of ecstasy or you come down off that high, you're going to feel incredibly depressed. You're going to feel terrible. You're not going to feel like yourself. And unfortunately, that is a permanent side effect. Sometimes these drugs have unwanted effects and even death, such as increase in blood pressure, decrease in urination, and dilation of the eyes. Also, many forms of MDMA or ecstasy are cut with other drugs or fillers, which can react poorly with you. I highly recommend you downloading this PowerPoint and watching the video that's linked below. It talks about people who it's interviews of people who have taken ecstasy or MDMA, and then they talk about how they feel afterwards. And what they'll talk about is how they feel so euphoric when they take the drug, but then how crummy they feel afterwards because they've altered the neurons in their brain. So today's discussion is all about the nervous system. And the nervous system is incredibly important for our survival. Cells in our bodies need to communicate with each other. And they need to communicate with each other so the body can communicate and integrate function as a whole. So cell communication involves 3 steps. First, the signaling molecule needs to be released by one cell. And then that signal needs to be transformed into a form that has an effect on another cell. And then that signal receiving cell is going to respond. Signals move very quickly through most animal bodies along an information highway consisting of neurons. Neurons are the cells that make up the nervous system. They are an excitable cell that transmits electrical signals along its plasma membrane and chemical messages to other cells. And below is a picture of a neuron. What's interesting is that organisms that are not nearly as sophisticated as us still have a nervous system. For example, cnidarians, such as this hydra shown to the left, or jellyfish, have something called a nerve net. And basically what happens is information flows in any direction among cells of a nerve net, and there's no centralized controlling organ that functions like a brain. All it has is just these nerves everywhere. So a nerve net is a mesh of interacting neurons with no central control organ, and it causes cells in the body to contract or alter the size of their mouths. Another example of a nerve net would be in starfish. Starfish have radial symmetry, which means that they are symmetrical going out from the center. And they also have a nerve net that includes nerves. And these nerves are actually bundled together into a connective tissue. So you can see here the different nerves of the starfish. Now, other organisms have something called bilateral cephalization. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, when we're talking about a bilateral organism, we are talking about an organism like this beetle or ourselves, in which you literally have 2 of everything, and you can see the symmetry. If you see this red line going down the beetle's back, you can see that each side is symmetrical. We also are bilateral. We have 2 hands, we have 2 arms, we have 2 feet, 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, 2 cheeks, 2 ears. And so if we were to fold ourselves in half, we should be symmetrical as well. Animals with bilateral cephalized bodies have 3 types of neurons. And we've discussed these neurons in the previous lecture. The first one is sensory neurons. These detect stimuli and send signals to motor neurons or interneurons. You have interneurons. These integrate information and send signals to one another or to motor neurons, and these are what I call the middlemen. And then you have motor neurons, and these carry signals to effectors like muscles and glands. So again, a sensory neuron is a neuron that responds to a specific internal or external stimulus and signals another neuron. So that would be light, touch, scent, sounds, any type of feelings that you might have. The interneuron, those are neurons that receive signals from and send signals to other neurons. I call these guys the middleman for communication. So they usually receive signals from a sensory neuron, and then what they do is they tell the motor neurons what to do. And a motor neuron is the neuron that receives a signal from another neuron and sends a signal to either a muscle or a gland, which basically would make you move or salivate or whatever it is that your body needs to do. Most animals that have bilateral symmetry also have cephalization. So what is cephalization? Basically what it is it's a bunch of neurons concentrated at the body's head. We have cephalization. It's called our brain. So here's an example of a planarian flatworm. And this flatworm has a bunch of nerves that are centralized in its head, which leads to cephalization. Some simple bilateral animals, such as those flatworms, have a nervous system with a cluster of ganglia at the head and ventral nerve cords running the length of the body and nerves extending from that nerve cord. And I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. This earthworm also has a very similar setup. Annelids such as earthworms and arthropods, which are insects, have paired nerve cords that run along the ventral or lower surface and connect to the simple brain. So what the heck am I talking about? Well, ganglion are a cluster of nerve cell bodies, and then you have nerve cords. So the nerve cord would be what you see right along here, and they run the length of the body, and then the nerve is neuron fibers bundled inside a sheath of connective tissue. A brain is a central control organ of a nervous system, and it receives and integrates sensory information. It's also important for regulating internal processes and sends out signals that bring about movement. For example, an octopus has a larger brain compared to other fish, and then of course we have brains as well. When we talk about vertebrate nervous systems, that would be our nervous system or any organism that has a spine. And vertebrate nervous systems are broken up into actually two different types of nervous systems. You have something called a central nervous system, and then we're going to talk about a different nervous system in a moment. So in vertebrates, the dorsal nerve cord evolved into a brain and spinal cord, which makes up the central nervous system. Anytime I ever talk about the central nervous system, I'm talking about the brain, and I'm talking about the spinal cord. Remember, chordates, and you can see the word cord in it, are animals with spinal cords. So if on your exam you see the word chordates, we're talking about any organism with a spinal cord. And most interneurons, or those middlemen, are what hang out in the central nervous system. So this is kind of like your integration center. The other type of nervous system that we have in our body is called the peripheral nervous system. And basically the peripheral nervous system does is it connects the brain and spinal cord to the rest of the body. So you see here in this picture, the brain and spinal cord are made up of the central nervous system, which is shown in pink. And the peripheral nervous system is all the other nerves in your body. And what they do is they usually send signals back up to the peripheral nervous system. Now there's two types of nerves in the peripheral nervous system, and you need to know each one. The first one is autonomic nerves. And I see the word automatic in this, autonomic nerves. And what it does is these nerves monitor and regulate internal state of body and control smooth muscles and cardiac muscles. And if you remember, both smooth and cardiac muscles are muscles we have no control over. They are important for automatic things like your heart beating or your digestive system working. You have no control over that, and these autonomic nerves are what are in charge of those muscles. And then your peripheral nervous system also has something called somatic nerves. And somatic nerves monitor your body's position and external stimuli, and these control skeletal muscles. So these are nerves that control muscles that we can control ourselves. So just to review, your central nervous system is made up of your brain and spinal cord, and most interneurons reside in the central nervous system. And then your peripheral nervous system are nerves that extend through the body and carry out signals to and from the central nervous system. And you have two types of nerves in the peripheral nervous system. You have your autonomic and your somatic. So again, nerves of the peripheral system fall into two functional categories, autonomic and somatic. Autonomic nerves are what monitor and regulate the internal state of the body, and they control smooth muscle and cardiac muscle and glands. So they are things that automatically happen in your body. You really don't have any control over them. Somatic nerves monitor the body's position and external environment, and they control skeletal muscles, which are muscles that we can control ourselves. So that's us flexing our biceps or walking. So what should you know? Excitable cells called neurons form communication lines in animal nervous system. Neurons of radially symmetrical animals connect as a nerve net. Neurons of bilaterally symmetrical animals are concentrated in the head, which is called cephalization, and one or more nerve cords runs the length of the body. In humans, we have a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system, and you should know the difference between autonomic and somatic nerves. So let's talk about neurons themselves. The structure of the neuron reflects its function as a building block of the nervous system. And things you should know, a neuron is a cell, so it does have a nucleus. And then it has three parts that I expect you to know. It has dendrites, which is shown here. It has an axon, shown here. And it has an axon terminal. And this whole cell allows for the neuron to receive and send messages. So the first part we're going to talk about is dendrites. Dendrites are the cytoplasmic branches that receive chemical signals sent by neurons. And I like to think of the dendrite as the catcher's mitt. So the dendrite is going to catch a signal from another cell, and then what it's going to do is it's going to transfer that signal into electricity, which is going to flow along the axon. So the axon is basically going to be of an area where that signal is going to travel as electricity. And once it gets to the axon terminal is going to release that signal as a neurotransmitter. So again, the dendrite of a neuron are these little cytoplasmic extensions, and that's what receives chemical signals sent by other neurons or other cells. The dendrite is the catcher's mitt of other signals. And then the axon is the length of the nerve, and what happens is that signal is going to get converted into electricity, which is going to travel along this nerve. Once it reaches the axon terminal is going to release that signal as a neurotransmitter or chemical signal. So this is how information typically flows in your body. Your sensory neuron is going to fire off, and then the dendrites of the inner neuron are going to receive that message, and then the inner neurons are then going to transmit that message to motor neurons. So for example, if you put your hand on a hot stove, your sensory neurons are going to fire off hot, hot, hot. Then the inner neurons in your brain and spinal cord are going to figure out what that sensory neuron is saying, and then tell the motor neurons in your hand to move off of that stove. Sensory neurons typically have no dendrites. Receptor endings of the peripheral axon respond to specific stimuli. Inner neurons have many signaling receiving dendrites and one short axon, and motor neurons have multiple short dendrites and a longer axon with terminals that signal a muscle or gland cell. And this is a picture. So here we have our sensory neuron. It's going to send something. It's going to then send the message to the inner neuron. The inner neuron is then going to basically figure out what the sensory neuron is telling it, and then it's going to translate it to the motor neuron, which is going to make the body react to whatever the sensory neuron has identified. The neuron's ability to send and receive messages stems from electrical properties of its membrane. What I want you to understand is whenever you see the term membrane potential, what we're talking about is the electricity that flows across the axon. That's all I need you to know about that. That electricity cannot pass directly from a neuron to another cell. Instead, the cell must relay the message as a chemical signal. Imagine having electricity flow through your body. That would not be good. So instead, what happens is once that axon reaches the axon terminal, the nerve cell is going to release the message as a chemical signal, which is called a neurotransmitter. So when action potential or the electrical signal arrives at the cell's axon terminal, it's going to trigger the release of a neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter molecule diffuses across something called the synaptic cleft and binds to receptor in another cell. You guys should probably watch this really awesome YouTube video if you download the lecture from Moodle, which actually will show you and explain how neurotransmitters get released by the cell. So what is a neurotransmitter? A neurotransmitter is a chemical signal released by an axon terminal. So this is the axon terminal, and these little balls are the neurotransmitters. A neuromuscular junction is a synapse between a neuron and a muscle. So this is a neuron, this is muscle tissue, and the space in which they reside in is called a neuromuscular junction. And acetylcholine is an example of a neurotransmitter. Another one that we've already talked about is serotonin, which is another neurotransmitter. After neurotransmitter molecules do their work, they must be removed from the synaptic cleft. And so what they do is they literally will release enzymes that will break down those neurotransmitters. So for example, if you were to remove your hand from that hot stove, your body's going to stop telling your hand that it's hot, right? Because those neurotransmitters are going to be basically removed from the synaptic cleft. Something that you guys should understand is that a typical neuron receives messages from many different neurons. So a neurotransmitter can have an inhibitory or an excitatory effect on a postsynaptic cleft. What can happen is it can increase the nerve's electricity or it could decrease the nerve's electricity. And the postsynaptic cell's response is determined by something called synaptic integration. Basically what happens is the nerve is going to take the summation or all of the excitatory and inhibitory signals by a cell, and then what it's going to do is it's going to respond. So a typical neuron receives messages from many neurons, and in a neuron in the brain can have thousands of incoming synapses, which means that one neuron in your brain is receiving thousands of signals at once, and so what it's going to need to do is identify what it needs to send out next based on the summation of all those signals. Different kinds of neurons release different types of neurotransmitters. For example, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine, serotonin, glutamate, and GABA are all different types of neurotransmitters. Different kinds of postsynaptic cells have receptors that respond differently to the same neurotransmitters. So receptors may be stimulating or inhibiting those neurons. So how do neurons work? Messages flow along a neuron's plasma membrane from input to output zones. So here we have our dendrites. They are going to catch a signal from a neurotransmitter. They're then going to transfer that signal into electricity along the axon. Once that electricity reaches the axon terminal, that message is then going to be converted into another neurotransmitter and released to another cell. There are many disorders of the nervous system, and they often involve a disruption of signaling at the synapses. So what that means is there's often some dysfunction of the neurotransmitters. Either not released or they are not accepted. Symptoms of neurological disorders may arise from lowered levels of neurotransmitter. Treatment with drugs raises the level of appropriate neurotransmitters. So for example, some antidepressants are going to increase the release of various neurotransmitters to make you feel better. Psychoactive drugs can mimic neurotransmitters or disrupt their release or uptake. So the first disorder we're going to talk about is Parkinson's disease. What happens in Parkinson's disease is that there's damage to dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter, secreting neurons in the part of the brain that governs motor control, which results in tremors, loss of balance, and involuntary movement. If you know who Michael J. Fox is or Muhammad Ali, both these individuals have Parkinson's disease. Unfortunately, Muhammad Ali just passed recently. And when you watch videos of them, you will literally see them tremoring. PET scans can show high metabolic activity in dopamine secreting neurons. And what happens is because there's damage to these parts of the brain, the individual has an inability to stop the tremors or involuntary movement. Another disease, well, I wouldn't even call it a disease, a disorder would be attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And what happens in these individuals is that they have a lower than normal dopamine level, which also, and what happens is these people have trouble concentrating and are unusually impulsive and tend to fidget when required to remain seated. Drugs used to treat ADHD are stimulants that increase dopamine availability in the brain. Especially for folks who might be working with individuals with ADHD, especially education majors, definitely watch this video. It's really fantastic. It has individuals with ADHD discussing how they feel in the classroom and kind of gives you some insight on what it's like to live with ADHD. My husband has ADHD, and sometimes it can be very frustrating for me to communicate with him because I don't think he's paying attention. When really he's just dealing with the symptoms of having a deficit in dopamine in his brain. Another disorder is Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is the leading cause of dementia or loss of ability to think. An affected person becomes increasingly confused and cannot communicate and eventually is incapable of living independently. These individuals usually have a lower than normal level of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine in the brain. Again, this is a terrific video that talks about Alzheimer's disease. This is a huge problem in the United States and is becoming an epidemic. Other issues you could have are mood disorders. These are interactions among several neurotransmitters, including serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, which all can affect your mood. Antidepressants, including Prozac and Paxil, can increase the level of serotonin in your brain by preventing its uptake. And also, sometimes depression has a genetic component, and families predisposed to depression may be prone to anxiety disorders. There are lots of effects to psychoactive drugs. People take psychoactive drugs, both legal and illegal, to alleviate pain, relieve stress, or feel pleasure. All major addictive drugs stimulate the release of dopamine, and habituation and tolerance can lead to drug addiction. So the first one is stimulants. Stimulants make users feel alert but also anxious, and they can interfere with fine motor skills. A great example would be caffeine or nicotine. Also, cocaine and amphetamines are all considered stimulants, and they affect various neurotransmitters in the brain. Narcotics, including morphine, codeine, heroin, fentanyl, and oxycodone, all mimic the effects of endorphins. Endorphins are natural painkillers that we produce by the central nervous system, and they also promote a feeling of pleasure. I always tell my students this in lecture, but if you are going on a blind date and you allow someone back in your house and you have any of these medications in your medicine cabinet, you should probably count your pills afterwards, because it's very common for people to steal codeine and oxycodone from other folks' medicine cabinets. Also, usually individuals who get hooked on these different prescription drugs move on to heroin. Ketamine and PCP can also numb the extremities by slowing the clearing of synapses. Depressants, such as alcohol and barbiturates, slow motor response by inhibiting acetylcholine output. So alcohol can also stimulate the release of endorphins and GABA, so users typically experience a brief euphoria followed by depression. Hallucinogens can distort sensory perception and bring on a dreamlike state. LSD resembles serotonin and binds to its receptors. Mescaline and psilocybin have weaker effects, and THC and marijuana alters levels of dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, and GABA in the brain. So some common neurological disorders cause symptoms by interfering with the flow of signals through the nervous system, and psychoactive drugs also affect the nervous system activity by raising or lowering the amount of signaling chemicals in the brain. Next, we're going to discuss the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nerves are bundles of axons that run through the body, carrying signals to and from the spinal cord and brain. Remember, your central nervous system is your brain and spinal cord, and your peripheral nervous system is everything else. As I had mentioned earlier, the peripheral nervous system is split up into two divisions: your somatic nervous system and your autonomic nervous system. somatic nervous system is a set of nerves that control skeletal muscles and relay signals from joints and skin. So these are nerves that control the muscles that you have control over. Autonomic nervous system is a set of nerves that relay signals to and from integral organs such as smooth and cardiac muscles and glands. And these are nerves that are going to make these muscles automatically do things like digest your food or make your heart beat. So please know the difference between autonomic and somatic nerves. Also, you have something called sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves, and they work opposite in most organs. If you've ever heard of flight or fight, these are kind of what are involved in that. So your sympathetic neurons of the autonomic system increase their output in times of stress or danger. So these occur in your autonomic neurons. So sympathetic neurons are going to increase their output during stress and danger. And then during less stressful times, like let's say you're just kicking on your couch, signals from the parasympathetic neurons dominate. So if you're about to get pulled over by a police officer and you hear the whoop whoop and like the flashing lights behind you and your heart starts to race and your mouth gets dry and you start to sweat, those would be your sympathetic neurons that are firing off. If you're just chilling on your couch, studying or watching TV, and you're super chill wearing your sweatpants, then your parasympathetic neurons are what are going to be dominating. So again, this is all part of your autonomic system. You have your sympathetic neurons and your parasympathetic neurons. Your sympathetic neurons are neurons of the autonomic system that prepare the body for danger. These are the ones that are going to make your heart race right before you go on a date or when you're getting pulled over by the police. The parasympathetic neurons are neurons of the autonomic system that encourage housekeeping tasks. These are the ones where you're just hanging on the couch feeling super chill. We're going to stop here and start up the rest of the lecture in part 2.